John Carpenter's The Thing is a masterclass in suspense, atmosphere, and body horror. The practical effects have aged like fine wine with grotesque abominations that I can't help but marvel at. The way the movie plays with the audience by keeping them guessing as to who is or isn't a monster makes it one of the most captivating films you'll ever experience. It is one of my favorite movies of all time and a must-watch for anyone that even has just a passing interest in horror or sci-fi, with one of the most bleak and ominous endings that leaves you in an existential crisis as the credits roll by. Even though the movie has a perfect ending that doesn't need any further elaboration, I often ask myself, what happens next? Well, thankfully in the summer of 2002, developers Computer Artworks answered that question with their sequel video game simply titled The Thing. The game takes place directly after the events of the film, and you assume control of Captain Blake as he and his team of special forces are sent to investigate the remnants of US Outpost North 31. The further you delve into the different sites located in this Arctic hellscape, you'll uncover a conspiracy where a corporation tries to experiment with an organism that's far beyond their understanding. The game is really an unofficial sequel, but John Carpenter himself gives the game his blessing and even makes a cameo appearance as one of the game's prominent characters. I actually reviewed this game a while back as part of a collaboration with my good pal Xavier, but in one of the most unexpected and pleasant surprises of this year, Nighdive Studios are continuing to do the Lord's work in the world of video game preservation and have given us yet another remaster of an old classic. Between Shadow Man, the Turok games, and now The Thing, Nighdive is quickly becoming one of my favorite video game studios. Seriously, these guys deserve their roses. I love what they're doing. They promise improvements that could make this a more enjoyable experience than the original, like enhanced visuals, smoother controls, and more modern video game sensibilities. Do these improvements make revisiting the Thing video game worthwhile today? Well, why don't you wait around for a little bit, see what happens. The first thing you'll undoubtedly notice is the game's impressive visual upgrade. I love when older games are remastered in this manner. It retains its original overall aesthetic, and you can still tell it's a PS2 era video game, but you get modern day enhancements like high resolution textures, dynamic lighting, and reworked character models. The high resolution textures do wonders for the gruesome scenes you'll often come across. What was once a blurry smudge of red blood is now a highly detailed macabre of torn flesh, spilled guts, and decapitated bodies. Not to sound like a sick freak, but this is an awesome enhancement for this game since revisiting the original PS2 game would probably make it a little laughable in this regard with its outdated visuals. Not to demean the original game, after all, I don't even think it looks that bad, and it certainly was effective for the time. But it's nice to see this game get propped up to a level that could potentially make someone squeamish at the sight of these corpses. Not to mention that violence and gore is one of the major ways that makes the 1982 film so memorable. The monsters here, pretty much being a walking mess of flesh themselves, have also benefited from the high-res textures, and it makes them look that much more freaky and intimidating. Character models have also gotten an overhaul, which honestly left me impressed, and where this has the most impact is in the faces. Characters are much more expressive and actually look discernible. Again, I love this approach to reworking character models in an older game. They're still very consistent with the way they look in their PS2 counterparts. You're not getting a hyper-realistic overhaul like The Last of Us Remake or the upcoming Metal Gear Solid Delta, but rather something that looks like a late 2000s PC game that has aged really well and has been modded with a texture pack. I think this approach to remasters is endlessly better than some other examples that have replaced the older models with something that's trying to change the original game's aesthetic and overall framework, like that Prince of Persia remake that Ubisoft thankfully pulled back on and is now reworking. My favorite update to the visuals is the inclusion of a dynamic and realistic lighting system. I think the original game already did a pretty good job of having a moody atmosphere, but with this new lighting system, that aspect has been improved tenfold. Environments are a lot darker now, but that only makes better use of your flashlight as your beam cuts through the darkness and creates these really effective scenes. Before, the flashlight created just a general glow around you, and while it got the job done, it doesn't hold a candle to how much more effective it is having an actual beam of light. Environments have extra detail too, like added debris, ice stalactites, and more effective snow effects. There's even a blue filter that brings the game closer to the movie's visual style. But what's really sure to make the hardcore fans wet their pants are the added Easter eggs, like the fire axe pierced into the door, leading to the room that McGrady and Copper investigate, and this once generic corpse that's now been swapped out with one that appears to be Null's, giving some closure to his fate, even though it was pretty obvious that he was killed off screen somehow. But I think this might actually be a deep-cut reference to the novelization of The Thing. In the book, Nulls takes his own life when he comes face to face with the Blair Thing. He slits its throat with a sharp piece of wood so the creature wouldn't have a chance to assimilate him. And in the remaster, we can see his body firmly grasping a sharp object, much like he was in the book. Before getting into the gameplay improvements Nighdive Studios implemented into the remaster, I want to give you a general overview of what kind of game this is. You'd be forgiven for thinking that this game is a survival horror experience, given the movie that it's based on. While there are moments of suspense and some jump scares here and there, this game is actually a lot more of an action horror experience. For starters, Blake starts his mission already strapped with a submachine gun that tears monsters apart, and it won't be long before you have a shotgun, flamethrower, and multiple types of grenades. Enemies are consistently being thrown at you, especially these raw chicken looking guys that are taken out by just a short burst of your SMG. You'll often find yourself running around the room, avoiding getting hit by some monstrosity as you and your squad mates unleash a hail of bullets. So there aren't that many opportunities for quiet moments to build up suspense. As I mentioned before, Blake is sent out with a team of US Special Forces, and you'll come across other members and scientists on the field that can tag along. They each fall into different classes consisting of medics that can patch you up, soldiers who are best suited for combat, and most importantly, engineers who have the ability to repair advanced junction boxes that are pivotal to level progression. The game advertises a squad management system that, on the surface, sounds more advanced than it actually is. The game talks about your teammates as being these living, breathing creatures with different personalities that react dynamically to the environment. And while there is some truth to that, it's never this nuanced part of gameplay that you have to engage with all that often, or that provides vastly different experiences with each playthrough. Your teammates can get freaked out by the mutilated bodies and viscera left behind by these creatures, and you can deal with this by simply asking them to stand across the room while you search around the gruesome scene, or give them a bit of a bravery boost by injecting them with adrenaline. If left unchecked, eventually your teammate will reach a state of panic that can cause him to be frozen in fear or fire his weapon uncontrollably. And well, we can't have that. To deal with these extremes, you can knock some sense into them by shocking them with a taser. Your teammate's psychological state is represented through the squad menu, which shows profiles of them, and depending on how they're feeling, they'll either be casually bopping around, whipping their heads back and forth in a panic, or seizing their brains out. I wish they had used the characters' improved facial animations to convey their emotions in a more subtle way, because Jesus Christ. When you come across survivors, they won't always be quick to join your team, as it is much appropriate to the film's themes. Paranoia has set in. You'll have to establish some sort of trust with them, and the most common way you'll be doing this is by giving them a weapon and some ammo, or by performing a blood test on yourself to prove you're not a thing.
Now I'm gonna show you what I already know.
Once they join your squad, you can give them simple commands like stay, follow, or fix this junction box. There's also a command to ask them to go to a specific location, but this is only ever used to complete required objectives. Really, the squad mechanics are as simple as can be. For the most part, you won't have to do much babysitting because all these guys can hold their own in a fight pretty well and keep a tight formation when you ask them to follow you. The NPC's AI is not without its faults though. There were a few instances where my teammates didn't mind standing in front of a turret as it peppered them with bullets, or idled around while there was a bomb set to blow up the building we're standing in. The most common thing you'll do when it comes to giving orders is asking the engineer class to repair junction boxes so you can progress to the next part of the level. This becomes far too much of a commonality across missions to the point where it becomes a little too familiar, and it made me wish that the game made clever uses of the other classes. There was one instance that I thought was pretty cool. There's a room that's inaccessible to Blake because these lasers are rigged to set off some turrets specifically by Blake's DNA. So you have to send one of your men to that room to retrieve the key item needed as you defend him from Thing monsters by controlling the aforementioned turrets through a terminal in a separate room. This was probably the most clever use of the squad commands, and I wish the game had more intricate uses of them sprinkled throughout. Like I said before, this is more of an action-oriented experience. Most of the time you'll just be pushing forward through a self-contained level, though you will come across locked doors or keypads that you have to find the code for. The key or terminal containing the code needed to open the door won't ever require you to scour the level for them, or solve a brain-teasing puzzle unlike Resident Evil or Silent Hill. Despite that, levels were always fun to play through for the simple fact that they're designed pretty well. You'll never get lost or confused by what you're supposed to do, which keeps the game moving at a steady pace. There's also a bit of room for exploration. When you're outside in sub-freezing temperatures, you're going to want to follow these lights that guide you to the next building, since staying outside in the cold for too long will eventually take a toll on your health points. But if you're daring enough and go off the beaten path, you can find extra ammo or medkits stashed away in shacks and the like. I wish the game had more enemy variety. You'd imagine that for a video game that features an alien organism that can assume any imaginable size, shape, or form, you would constantly be coming face to face with different looking abominations. There are different enemy types, of course, like the Walker and a bull-like monster, but there's a certain one that gets used way too often, and those are the Scuttler types. These are the small, raw chicken looking ones I mentioned before, and they're a fodder type of enemy. They're the most common one you'll come across, and you can easily take out with a short burst from your gun. It makes sense that this game contains an enemy like this, since they are very reminiscent of the upside down head spider thing from the movie, but man, I just don't find this kind of enemy fun to fight. They make up like 90% of the enemies you come across, and the way they bounce around and shriek as I whip my gun around trying to keep up with them makes me feel like a Kentucky Fried idiot. I much prefer fighting the bigger and more humanoid looking monsters. Their designs are way cooler, and I like that they won't go down unless you deliver the killing blow with a flamethrower, which of course is accurate to the movies. They let out these low-pitched wailing sounds that are super creepy and otherworldly. The bosses are also really gnarly looking. They're easily the most freakish, being this giant mound of twisted limbs and imitations of familiar creatures. One of the most demanded mechanics to be improved on is the whole infection or assimilation system. This was probably the most criticized aspect of the original game, because many people thought that it would be this dynamic system where anyone can be a thing, and that it would offer different experiences with every playthrough, keeping the players paranoid and guessing as to who is who they say they are. But the reality of the Thing's assimilation system was that NPC transformations were disappointingly scripted. These two guys will always be a thing in every playthrough. This guy will always be a thing in every playthrough. You will always be a thing in every playthrough. Nah, I'm just kidding. Or am I? There were also points where the game just doesn't even follow its own established rules. You would test one of your own squad mates' blood to see if they're infected, and it would turn out negative, only to then step into the next room and your buddy's head would start splitting apart, revealing their true nature. This happens because there are points in the game where you're supposed to be alone. Like whenever you're about to fight a boss, you're meant to face these monsters alone, so if you still happen to have a squad mate with you just before stepping into the boss room, the game will force that poor bastard into a thing as a way to correct the problem. A dynamic infection system just isn't possible with the kind of strict and rigid level design this game has. Take the engineers for example. These guys are critical to simply progressing through the game. They're absolutely needed in order to open certain doors, so much so that if they die, that'll result in a fail state. So when it comes to these guys getting infected or assimilated by the Thing alien, they're guaranteed immunity. With that in mind, we have to be realistic when it comes to the fixes Nighdive can implement to the infection system in this remaster. It's simply not possible to have it be so that any NPC can become assimilated dynamically like fans have been wanting from a Thing video game for so long. That would require a full-on top-to-bottom remake or reimagining. To put it bluntly, a brand new The Thing video game with that vision in mind from the get-go. This remaster is still fundamentally that same PS2 game from 2002 with some enhancements. With that said, they did address the problem of NPCs contradicting their negative blood test and still turning into a Thing monster. When I was going down this hallway, I distinctly remember this particular NPC always turning into a Thing without fail, just before this door that leads to a boss fight. So I tested him to make sure he was still human, and he was clean. So I continued down the hallway and was pleasantly surprised when he didn't burst into a mess of mangled flesh and claws. But the game still can't have him be a part of the boss fight, so what they do is have this scripted event where a swarm of scuttlers jump on him and quickly infect him, thus turning him into a Thing. I think this is a clever way of addressing that issue, but it kinda dumbs down the way the Thing alien works. It essentially functions like a zombie virus now, and that's not right. The alien organism is supposed to absorb its victims as it takes on its properties. But still, this is certainly the best case scenario given the circumstances, and I don't want to be an obnoxious nerd about it. You'll also reach certain points where NPCs can't follow you anymore. Like for example, they're unable to crawl through vents. In the original game, whenever you reach these points, they would just stand there awkwardly staring you as you abandon them. In the remaster, if they're not engineers, they'll be more prone to getting infected when coming into contact with enemies. And if they manage to survive, there'll be some sort of scripted sequence that kills them, like a perfectly timed explosion. Controls have also been improved. Switching weapons and items can now be done through a radial wheel that slows down time rather than stopping the action completely, and this one I really appreciated. It just minimizes interruptions to the moment-to-moment gameplay and makes for a more seamless experience, especially since you'll be switching to your flamethrower frequently. The aiming controls are one of the aspects of the original game that certainly aged less than gracefully, operating on a bit of a janky lock-on system. There's still a lock-on system here, and it's a little too effective. All you gotta do is hover the reticle over enemies and you're dead set. There are settings that adjust the intensity of the lock-on system, but still, they're all really generous. It'd be nice if the game allowed you to turn off the lock-on system completely. The reticle will also let you know when you've done enough damage to enemies and are ready to be barbecued with your flamethrower with this little flame icon. There's a gyro sensor setting if you want to use motion controls to aim. Personally, this never feels intuitive to me unless I'm using a Joy-Con controller. And I do think the game is on Switch, so that could be something you could look into. Items, whether they be keys, documents, ammo, or medkits, have a glowing effect now, so they're hard to miss. One of the biggest problems that makes recommending playing the original The Thing video game today are these jarring difficulty spikes that make the game feel terribly balanced. You can easily softlock yourself if you're too reckless with ammo or use up too many medkits. I experienced this myself when I played the game a while back, and well, it certainly did make for a nerve-wracking experience as I inched my way through a level with a sliver of health left, but frankly, it makes the original game more frustrating than anything. To remedy this, Nighdive littered levels with tons of ammo and medkits. I never found myself strapped for any kind of resource. Now, the issue is that between the abundance of resources and how effective the lock-on system is, The Thing Remastered is an absolute cakewalk. I died maybe 3 or 4 times and most of them were flukes. Like when I shot an explosive barrel that I was standing a little too close to, or when I missed the exit to this building that was set to blow up. Man, I die from explosions a lot. I also found that enemies take a hell of a lot less bullets to kill. I remember coming across the walker and bull type of thing monsters being this oh shit kind of moment in the original game. In here, I never broke a sweat. I also didn't find them to be as aggressive as I remember them. They spent most of the encounters running around aimlessly or just standing there. The same can be said for the bosses. There was one where I spent the majority of the fight standing in place with my finger firmly pressed on the trigger, not worrying about taking damage from the boss. The human enemies that you face toward the end of the game also suffer from this problem, which sucks because this is where the game is supposed to be at its hardest. Here's the thing though, I think it's kind of novel for a remaster of an old game to be easier than you remember. As someone who's often revisiting games from the PS2 and PS1 era, I've played plenty of games that have terrible difficulty balancing, and it really sours the experience. The original game certainly provided more of a challenge, but not in a way that felt rewarding. Of course, the best possible case would be to have a remaster that offers a classic mode that keeps the experience as accurate to the original as possible, but if I had to choose between a remaster that provided a completely accurate experience of the original game, frustrations be damned, or one that lets me re-experience an old gem as a sort of gentle stroll through memory lane, I think I choose the latter. With that being said, I think $30 for a game that I managed to beat in just 4 hours is a bit steep. I also did come across some bugs that need addressing. I turned invisible on 3 different occasions after toggling on the first person view, and the last time I checked, this wasn't a Hollow Man tie-in game. I read somewhere that if this remaster does well enough, it may lead to that cancelled sequel getting resurrected. The original devs got into early production for it before it got canned, and they had far more ambitious ideas for it, like having the highly demanded non-scripted infection system and a more in-depth trust system. If that's the case, I'm gonna need everyone out there to ignore what I said about $30 being too much for this remaster and just buy it. Just buy it, please. Buy every damn copy, I tell you. Anyway, those are my thoughts on The Thing Remastered. Special thanks to Carlos and Sam for joining at the top tier. You guys are certified superheroes. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.